Hello, everybody. I am Mrs. Poppet, and this is my place. I'm so glad you came back again today to see part 2 of The Traveling Companion. It's getting very exciting, isn't it? If you remember, John and his companion had just gotten to the town where the palace was, and he had heard all about the princess who was so wicked that she would kill any man who tried to win her hand, prince or pauper, if they could not guess the 3 things that she was thinking of. But John didn't care. He took one look at her and fell in love and knew he had to try. So he set off for the palace even though everybody tried to stop him. John walked to the palace. "Come in," said the king as John knocked at the door. John opened it, and the old king, in a dressing gown and embroidered slippers, came towards him. He had the crown on his head, and carried his scepter in one hand and an orb in the other. "Wait a bit," he said, and he placed the orb under his arm, so that he could offer the other hand to John. But when he found that John was another suitor, he began to weep violently. So violently that both the scepter and the orb fell to the ground, and he was obliged to wipe his eyes with his dressing gown. Poor old king! "Let her alone," he said. "You will fare as badly as all the others. Come, I will show you." Then he led him out into the princess's pleasure gardens, and there he saw a frightful sight. On every tree hung 3 or 4 kings' sons who had wooed the princess but had not been able to guess the riddles that she gave them. Their skeletons rattled in the breeze so that the terrified birds never dared to venture into the garden. All the flowers were supported by human bones instead of sticks, and human skulls in the flower pots grinned horribly. It was really a doleful garden. "Do you see all of this?" said the old king. "Your fate will be the same as those who are here. Therefore, do not attempt it. You really make me very unhappy. I take these things to heart so much." John kissed the good king's hand and said he was sure he'd be all right, for he was quite enchanted with the beautiful princess. Then the princess herself came riding into the palace yard with all her ladies, and he wished her good morning. She looked wonderfully fair and lovely when she offered her hand to John, and he loved her more than ever. How could she be a wicked witch, as all the people asserted? He accompanied her into the hall, and the little pages offered him nuts and sweetmeats, but the old king was so unhappy he could eat nothing. Besides, gingerbread and nuts were too hard for him. It was decided that John should come to the palace the next day, when the judges and the whole counselors would be present, so that he could try if he could guess the first riddle. If he succeeded, he would have to come a second time, but if not, he would lose his life. And no one had ever been able to guess even the first one. Now, John was not at all anxious about the result of his trial. On the contrary, he was very merry. He thought only of the beautiful princess and believed that in some way he should have help, but how he knew not, and he did not like to think about it. So he danced along the high road as he went back to the inn, where he had left his fellow traveler waiting for him. John could not refrain from telling him how gracious the princess had been, and how beautiful she looked. He longed for the next day so much that he might go to the palace and try his luck at guessing the riddles. But his comrade shook his head and looked very mournful. "I do not wish you to do well," he said. "We might have continued together much longer, and now I'm likely to lose you. You poor dear John, I could shed tears, but I will not make you unhappy on the last night we may be together. We will be merry, really merry this evening. Tomorrow, after you are gone, I shall be able to weep undisturbed." It was very quickly known among the inhabitants of the town that another suitor had arrived for the princess, and there was great sorrow in consequence. The theater remained closed. The woman who sold sweetmeats tied crape around the sugar sticks, and the king and the priest were on their knees in the church. There was a great lamentation, for no one expected John to succeed better than those other suitors before. In the evening John's comrade prepared a large bowl of punch, and said, "Now let us be merry and drink to the health of the princess." But after drinking 2 glasses, John became so sleepy that he could not keep his eyes open, and he fell asleep. Then his fellow traveler lifted him gently out of his chair and laid him on the bed, and as soon as it was quite dark, he took the 2 large wings which he'd cut from the dead swan, and tied them firmly to his own shoulders. Then he put into his pocket the largest of the 3 rods which he had obtained from the old woman who had fallen and broken her leg. After this he opened the window and flew away over the town straight towards the palace, and seated himself in a corner under the window which looked into the bedroom of the princess. The town was perfectly still when the clock struck 11:45. Presently the window opened, and the princess, who had large black wings to her shoulders and a long white mantle, flew away over the city towards a high mountain. The fellow traveler, who made himself invisible so she could not possibly see him, flew after her through the air, and whipped the princess with his rod so that blood came wherever he struck her. Ah, it was a strange flight through the air! The wind caught her mantle, so it spread out on all sides like the large sail of a ship, and the moon shone through it. "Oh, how that hail hurts, to be sure!" said the princess at each blow she received from the rod, and it served her right to be whipped. At last she reached the side of the mountain and knocked. The mountain opened with a noise like a roll of thunder, and the princess went in. The traveler followed her. No one could see him, as he had made himself invisible. They went through a long, wide passage. 1,000 gleaming spiders ran here and there on walls, causing them to glitter as if they were illuminated by fire. They next entered a large hall built of silver and gold. Large red and blue flowers shone on the walls, looking like sunflowers in size, but no one could dare to pluck them, for the stems were hideous, poisonous snakes, and the flowers were flames of fire darting out their jaws. Shining glowworms covered the ceiling, and sky-blue bats flapped their transparent wings. Altogether, the place had a very frightful appearance. In the middle of the floor stood a throne supported by 4 skeleton horses, whose harness had been made by fiery red spiders. The throne itself was made of milk-white glass. The cushions were little black mice, each biting the other's tail. Over it hung a canopy of rose-colored spider webs spotted with the prettiest little green flies, which sparkled like precious stones. On the throne sat an old magician with a crown on his ugly head and a scepter in his hand. He kissed the princess on the forehead and seated her by his side on the splendid throne, and the music commenced. Great black grasshoppers played the mouth organ. The owl struck himself on the body instead of a drum. It was altogether a ridiculous concert. Little black goblins with false lights in their caps danced about the hall, but no one could see the traveler, and he had placed himself just behind the throne, where he could see and hear everything. The courtiers who came in after looked like noble and grand, but anyone with common sense could see what they really were, only broomsticks with cabbages for heads. The magician had given them life and dressed them in embroidered robes. It answered very well, as they were only wanted for show. After there had been a little dancing, the princess told the magician she had a new suitor, and asked him what she could think of for the suitor to guess when he came to the castle the next morning. "Listen to what I say," said the magician. "You must choose something very easy. He will be less likely to guess it then. Think of one of your shoes. He will never imagine that is it. Then cut off his head, and mind you, do not forget to bring me his eyes with you tomorrow night, that I may eat them." The princess curtsied low and said she would not forget the eyes. The magician then opened the mountain, and she flew home again, but the traveler followed and flogged her so much with the rod that she sighed quite deeply about the heavy hailstorm, and made as much haste as she could to get back to her bedroom through the window. The traveler then returned to the inn where John still slept, took off his wings, and laid down on the bed, for he was very tired. Early in the morning John awoke, and when his fellow traveler got up, he said that he had had a very wonderful dream about the princess and her shoe, and he therefore advised John to ask her if she had not thought of her shoe. Of course the traveler knew this from what the magician on the mountain had said. "I may as well say that as anything," said John. "Perhaps your dream may come true. Still, I will say farewell, for if I guess wrong, I shall never see you again." Then they embraced each other, and John went into town and walked to the palace. The great hall was full of people, and the judges sat in armchairs with eiderdown cushions to rest their heads, because they had so much to think of. The old king stood near, wiping his eyes with his white pocket handkerchief, and when the princess entered she looked even more beautiful than she had appeared the day before, and greeted everyone present most gracefully, but to John she gave her hand and said, "Good morning to you." Now came the time for John to guess what she was thinking of, and oh, how kindly she looked at him when she spoke, but when he uttered the single word "shoe," she turned pale as a ghost, for all her wisdom could not help her, for he had guessed rightly. Oh, how pleased the old king was! It was quite amusing to see how he capered about. All the people clapped their hands, and both on his account and John's, who had guessed rightly the first time. His fellow traveler was glad also when he heard how successful John had been. But John folded his hands and thanked God, who he felt quite sure would help him again, and he knew he had to guess twice more. The evening passed pleasantly like the preceding. When John slept, his companion flew behind the princess to the mountain and flogged her even harder than before. This time he had taken 2 rods with him. No one saw him go in with her, and he heard all that was said. The princess this time was to think of a glove, and he told John if he had heard it in a dream. The next day, therefore, he was able to correctly guess the second time, and it caused great rejoicing at the palace. The whole court jumped about as they had seen the king do the day before, but the princess lay on the sofa and would not say a single word. All now depended on John. If only he guessed rightly the 3rd time, he would marry the princess and reign over the kingdom after the death of the old king. But that evening John said, but if he failed, he would lose his life, and the magician would have his beautiful blue eyes. That evening John said his prayers and went to bed very early, and soon fell asleep calmly and peacefully. But his companion tied on his wings to his shoulders, took 3 rods, and with the sword at his side flew to the palace. It was a very dark night, and so stormy that tiles flew from the roofs of the houses, and the trees in the garden upon which the skeletons hung bent themselves like reeds before the wind. The lightning flashed, the thunder rolled in one long continuous peal all night. The window of the castle opened, and the princess flew out. She was pale as death, but she laughed at the storm, ha! As if it were not bad enough. Her white mantle fluttered in the wind like a large sail, and the traveler flogged her with 3 rods till the blood trickled down, and at last she could scarcely fly. She contrived, however, to reach the mountain, "What a hailstorm!" she said as she entered. "I have never been out in such weather as this."
"Yes, there may be too much of a good thing sometimes," said the magician.
Then the princess told him that John had guessed rightly the second time, and if he succeeded the next morning, he would win, and she could never come to the mountain again or practice magic as she had done, and therefore she would be quite unhappy.
"I will find something for you to think of which you will never guess unless he's a greater conjurer than myself. But now let's be merry."
Then he took the princess by both hands, and they danced with all the little goblins and jack-o'-lanterns in the room. The red spiders sprang here and there on the walls quite merrily, and the flowers of fire appeared as if they were throwing out sparks. The owl beat the drum, the crickets whistled, the grasshopper played the mouth organ. It was a very ridiculous ball. After they had danced enough, the princess was obliged to go home, for fear she should be missed at the palace. The magician offered to go with her, that they might be company to each other on the way. Then they flew away through the bad weather, and the traveler followed them and broke his 3 rods across their shoulders. The magician had never been out in such a hailstorm as this. Just by the palace the magician stopped to wish the princess farewell and to whisper in her ear, "Tomorrow think of my head." But the traveler heard it, and just as the princess slipped through the window into her bedroom, and the magician turned around to fly back to the mountain, he seized him by the long black beard, with his saber cut off the wicked court conjurer's head just behind the shoulders, so that he could not even see who it was. He threw the body into the sea, to the fishes, and after dipping the head into the water, he tied it up in a silk handkerchief, took it with him to the inn, and then went to bed. The next morning he gave John the handkerchief, and told him not to untie it until the princess asked him what he was thinking of. There were so many people in the great hall of the palace that they stood thick as radishes tied together in bundles. The council sat in their armchairs with white cushions, and the old king wore new robes, and the golden crown and scepter had been polished up, so he looked quite smart. But the princess was very pale, and wore a black dress as if she were going to a funeral. "What have I thought of?" asked the princess of John. He immediately untied the handkerchief, and was himself quite frightened when he saw the head of the ugly magician. Everyone shuddered, for it was terrible to look at, but the princess sat like a statue, and could not utter a single word. At length she rose, and gave John her hand, for he had guessed rightly. She looked at no one else, but sighed deeply. "You are my master now. This evening our marriage shall take place."
"I'm very pleased to hear it," said the king. "It's just what I wished for."
Then all the people in the street shouted, "Hurrah! Hurrah!" The band played music in the streets, bells rang, the cake woman took the black crepe off the sugar sticks. There was universal joy. 3 oxen stuffed with ducks and chickens were roasted whole in the marketplace, where everyone might help himself to a slice. The fountains spouted forth the most delicious wine, and whoever bought a penny loaf at the baker's received 6 large buns full of raisins as a present. In the evening the whole town was illuminated. The soldiers fired off cannons, and the boys let off firecrackers. There was eating and drinking and dancing and jumping everywhere. In the palace, the high-born gentlemen and beautiful ladies danced with each other, and they could be heard at great distance singing the following song. "Here are the maidens young and fair, dancing in the summer air. Like 2 spinning wheels at play, pretty maidens dance away. Dance the spring and summer through, till the sole falls from your shoe." But the princess was still a witch, and she could not love John. His fellow traveler had thought of that, so he gave John 3 feathers out of the swan's wings and a little bottle with a few drops in it, He told him to place a large bath full of water by the princess's bed and put in the feathers and the drops. Then, at the moment she was about to get into bed, he must give her a little push so that she might fall into the water and then dip her 3 times. This would destroy the power of the magician, and she would love him so very much. The princess shrieked, "Ah!" when he dipped her under the water the first time, and struggled under his hands in the form of a great black swan with fiery eyes. As she rose the second time from the water, the swan had become white with a black ring around its neck. John allowed the water to close once more over the bird, and at the same time it changed into the most beautiful princess ever. She was more lovely even than before, and thanked him, while her eyes sparkled with tears for having broken the spell of the magician. The next day the king came with the whole court to offer their congratulations, and stayed till quite late. Last of all came the traveling companion. He had his staff in his hand and his knapsack on his back. John kissed him many times, and told him that he must not go, for he must remain with him, for he was the cause of all his good fortune. But the traveler shook his head and said kindly, "No, my time is now up. I have only paid my debt to you. Do you remember the dead man whom the bad people wished to throw out of his coffin? You gave all you possessed that he might rest in his grave. I am that man." As he said this, he vanished. The wedding festivities lasted a whole month. John and his princess loved each other dearly, and the old king lived to see many a happy day when he took their children on his knee and let them play with his scepter. And John became king over the whole country. Isn't that a wonderful story? All the excitement and adventure that John had to go through, and how the help he got from his traveling companion, and who knew that someone that he had helped when he was dead and needing it the most came back to help him and give him everything he deserved. And because John was so good, he was able to succeed at life and have all the good things given back to him. What a great story, and what a great message. Let's always be good and kind and do the right thing and help people when we can. Anyway, that's it for today. See you tomorrow.